All right. So I talked about immigrants. I talked about cities, and now the last element is something that emerges out of and in response to the previous two things. So the progressive movement and the reform movements of this time period largely emerge out of cities. And a lot of them emerge to directly address or in some way address issues being faced by immigrants, right? Workplace safety, health and safety, proselytizing, right? The Catholics need to, be Protestant, whatever, child care or family planning, which is some of the darker side of some of the early women's rights stuff around birth control, that it was actually for controlling how many kids immigrants would have. So, anyway, all of this stuff to say a lot of the progressive and reform movements are emerge out of this kind of point of intersection between immigration, immigrants, immigrant cultures, and the infrastructure of the city. Um, Progressive era is not a fascist movement. There's some kind of dumb thing in that whatever that 1776 report that didn't have any historians on it, which historians have subsequently kind of lampooned about the progressives being fascists or whatever. What? What? Who knows? Who knows what happens in the world? Again, as I said with the nativist politics, right? Politics doesn't need to be true; it just needs to win. But certainly, that's not a winning argument. That's like a really bad. That's like a bad DBQ. Anyway, let's get back on topic here. Reform. So the reform movement, again, big picture stuff, easy to remember stuff. There's a couple different flavors of the reform movement. One is moralistic. That's the one that is the predominant strain because it's less radical. Is led by middle class, upper middle class Protestants. These are the people who don't want, these are temperance and suffrage kind of folks. And then there's the economic approach, which is a little bit more radical, both in its avowed politics, but also in the fact that simply by being led by the working class and not being a upper middle class led movement, it is a threat, right? That immigrants would be leading these kind of economic reforms is seen as a threat by some. So who are these folks? Jacob Riis, picture in the background, right? This is the guy that took pictures of poor people's houses or their apartments, how the other half lived. It's in the book. Jane Addams of Hull House, or as a professor that I TA'd for used to say, more like Dull House. I don't know why he thought that was so. I mean, I guess now I think that's so funny. It's such a dumb joke, and like no one ever laughed at it. But now here I am, cats in the cradle. So anyway, Jane Addams and Hull House, right, leading reform of immigrant women. That is, as the book says, an AP must know. You must know about Hull House because it's indicative of all of this other stuff. It's like a little Pandora's box. If you know Hull House, it opens up to moralistic reform, temperance, immigration, anti-immigration, all that stuff. Walter Rauschenbusch, we don't really get into that much. I don't know if he's even mentioned in the book. Um, uh, the thing to remember about this school of thought is that the problem is the person. It's moralistic. It's condescending, right? People are good, people are bad, people are lazy, and they need to be fixed, right? They need morals. They need Christianity. Again, like the Catholics would say, like, "Ayo, like this is like the OG Christianity. Like we got it. Don't worry about it. We're good." But like Protestant evangelical Christianity, they need to work hard. Again, they're like working multiple jobs. They're like crammed in. They're not say they're not working hard. They're working really hard. They're just not making any money. But the issue here is moralistic, right? We need to teach folks morals, and even with at the level of their diet, and they're not consuming alcohol. Again, this goes back to some of the stuff from the 1830s. If you can control your body and your bodily urges, right, and regiment it, then you're going to have enough of those people. You get a regimented and controlled society. This is the moralistic approach to reform. And you're a bad person, right? So, like, this is like if you're on welfare, it's because you're lazy, right? Again, that is a modern uh, uh, version of the same old kind of tired uh, trope here, right? The problem is you just not doing something right. And then, of course, this solution then is individual. Individuals, these tens of thousands, right? These hundreds of thousands of individuals who all have this particular problem need to all, as individuals, right, work harder, find the Lord, what have you, right? So it's an individualized approach. The economic one, Henry George, this is the guy that actually one of his followers invented monopoly. Georgism is kind of like socialism light. It's mostly like about wealth, uh, equitable wealth distribution, and also anti-rent was a Georgist thing. Edward Bellamy, this is the guy that wrote the Looking Backwards, the book where you go into the future and people work like 4 hours a day and machines do everything else, and then the rest of the time people, workers all have off. Well, Bellamy didn't account for something in that book. This approach says the problem is not personal. The problem is the system. It's a systemic problem, right? So all those tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of people, it's not just that by coincidence they all happen to be lazy. It's that there's a system in place that's not allowing them to make more money, right? People are made this way. People are put into these circumstances. They are not inherently, right? So it's not that you're a bad person. It's that you've been put in a situation where you aren't making enough money. And in order to feed your family, maybe you I don't know, engage in some kind of black market economy or something like that. It's not that it's a nature versus nurture thing, right? On the moralistic is a nature argument. The economic is a nurture argument. It's not that you need to find the Lord. It's that you need some money, right? Like you're not going to live in a ghetto apartment if you have money. You're not going to work in a dangerous job if you have other options. And in this rendering, right, the solution then is the state, right? The state needs to step in and minimum wage laws or workplace safety codes and all this kind of stuff. It's not about individual personal reform. It's about a systemic problem that needs systemic answers, right? This is, at this point, not the main strain. The main strain is the moralistic strain. But progressivism is important. And it's important to know about what happens in this time period. So for one, we learned about the populists, right? The Grange movement, all those rural. So if you think populist, think rural. If you think progressive, think urban. The populists wanted more government regulation of, the rates that people paid for shipping their grain across state lines by trains and stuff like that. So the progressive movement is indebted to that earlier movement. It's also indebted to a longer history, a much longer history of folks that don't like business and don't like money in general, don't like banking, don't like finance. Jefferson was like this. Andrew Jackson was like this. And in a weird way, the progressives are also like this. Right? The issue is that they want more power in the hands of, everyday people. That's what Jefferson wanted. Wasn't talking about the enslaved, of course. That's what Jackson wanted. Wouldn't talk about Native Americans. But this is what the progressives want, right? They want more power in the hands of the people. So this is a really, really important thing to remember here, that if we're looking at this genealogy, right, from Jefferson, anti-government, more power to the people, to Jackson, anti-government, more power to the people, to the progressives, more power to the people, it's not anti-government anymore, right? It's anti-corporate. The corporations become the problem. They still want more power for people. They still think that there's some entity out there that's too powerful and that needs to be controlled. The difference is for the 18th and 19th centuries, it's not, like the bank of the central bank of the United States, for Jackson and Jefferson was a problem, but that's a government agency. Washington, the federal government, is the threat. The federal government is the thing that's going to take away rights at the local level. What the progressives say is, look, the federal government is anemic. It doesn't have any power. It's on the side of big corporations. It's not threatening to take away local rights. It's not threatening, local individuals to take away their freedom. What's taking away their people's freedoms are these big corporations. The railroads and other big industries are forcing people into jobs they don't want. They're taking land. They have more say than people at the ballot box. That's a problem. So this is a really key shift for looking at this genealogy, that the federal government isn't the problem anymore. And that's why the federal government becomes the solution for the progressives. That the big bad, the beast, the thing that you need to control, the thing that's going to take away democracy and freedom is no longer Washington, D.C., as it was for Jefferson or for Jackson. Washington, D.C. doesn't do anything, right? They certainly don't, aren't interested in taking rights away from everyday Americans. They're giving too much power to the corporations, and that's why the idea is limit the power of big business, limit laissez-faire economics by strengthening the hand of government. The government needs to pass legislation because the government has that authority. Right? Make constitutional amendments, pass laws, pass executive orders, do all of this stuff that can rein in, right, the total freedom of the market, and expand democracy, right? So again, the thinking here is if Rockefeller and Carnegie have more political power than 200 other people, these two men have more sway over the democratic process than 200 or 2,000 or 200,000. That ain't democracy, right? You can you can be a stan for like billionaires. Good for you. Go ahead and do it. But it ain't democracy, right? Like democracy is one person, one vote. And this is the argument that progressives are making, right? More democracy is what is needed, and you control, right, by reining in corporations. That's how you do that. This is a kind of social justice movement. It's not the same as the social justice movements we have in the 21st century, but it's about social justice. And a key to the progressive ideology here is it's just about logic. It's about science. It's about empiricism. Let's look at the actual evidence of all of these people living in poverty, all of the harm it does, all of the money it costs local governments. Let's logically think of a way to fix that, right? Urban reform movements, sanitation, new buildings, higher wages, etc. It's not some politically partisan thing. It's just like a no-brainer. It's like logic. You go, you do the research, you find out what's happening, you propose a solution. It's purely empirical, factual stuff, right? Who are these people, the progressives? This might sound like what I'm saying is some kind of radical, like there's some kind of radical anarchists or whatever. They're not, right? There's people who are to the left of this movement. These are urban, religious, middle class, college educated people who are saying this just makes sense, right? It makes sense to have the government pass laws to control corporations. It makes sense to have basic public health laws. It makes sense to have workers' rights or, women's rights or protection for certain groups or what have you. It's not the socialists who are also part of this, but it's not them. Right, and I'll have more about that in a couple slides from now. The relationship between the leftist politics and then the progressive politics, and then the more conservative, middle of the road politics, and then conservative politics. Okay, then the last thing here is muckraking. This inherits the tradition of yellow journalism. So yellow journalism was made up stories, where muckraking is yellow journalism plus facts. Right, so it's not just sensationalized stuff. It is investigative journalism. right? And it's a little sensationalized. It's a little bit like, ooh, like, pulling at, the emotions of the reader, but it is based in, right, actual evidence. Um, it does raise, I mean, I hate this term in the 21st century context about we really want to raise awareness about like breast cancer. It's like everyone knows what breast cancer is. Like you need money, like you need a cure, like you don't need awareness. Everything is always about awareness, awareness. It's like we don't need awareness, right? We have the internet. You don't need awareness when you can just like Google it and find out. In this context, this is raising awareness in that like people didn't know this stuff was happening. People didn't know that they were eating meat that was like disgusting. People didn't know that the Standard Oil Company was engaging in these devious practices that had nothing to actually do with the free market. It was very manipulative of prices and of supply and things like that. This stuff gets published in a lot of magazines. McClure's Cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitan isn't like the Cosmopolitan now, right? It's like a real magazine. It's not just like makeup advice or something. All kinds of novels here you see in the background. Ida B. Tarbell, The History of the Standard Oil Company, The Octopus by Frank Norris, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. The irony, of course, of The Jungle is that it wasn't supposed to be about food safety. It was supposed to be about the deplorable kind of working conditions of the people who worked in this industry, but it was so gross that the American public thought, we need like to have more oversight of the food we're eating. Meanwhile, the workers like, no, excuse me, like that's not supposed to be. You misread it. Anyway, How the Other Half Lives. Jacob Riis looking at all these kind of ghetto homes. Muckraking formula is pretty simple. You find a scandal, you uncover it, you attack it, you use facts, a little bit of sensationalism, and it has a really big impact on readers, right? It really does affect readers. It changes legislation. It alters the way governments work, especially the government of Teddy Roosevelt, very reform minded. And again, improves on the tradition of yellow journalism, more based in facts, less on kind of just pure sensationalism. You still want to make money, you still want to sell copy, but it's more fact based. All right, lastly, some of the aims and the contradictions of the progressive movement. Health and safety. There's tons of stuff in your book on this, right? More windows in every room of an apartment, running water, electricity, food safety, as the Upton Sinclair story goes. Vice and crime, anti-sex work or prostitution, anti-black market economies, right? Wanting to clean up the city. A lot of this stuff has to do with immigration too, because the sex workers were often poor immigrant women, right? And they were like engaging in sex work to make money because they didn't make enough money in their jobs because their jobs didn't pay them enough money. Or black market economies, right? So the Tong of the Chinese or the mafia of the Italians, Irish mob, Jewish mob. Anytime a community of people, whether it's black migrants, Italian immigrants, Jewish immigrants, Chinese immigrants, if they're not given access to mainstream economic gains, the main loans, banking, etc., there's going to be a black market economy that's going to emerge that's going to satisfy those demands. This is where we get mutual aid societies. It's also where we get the mafia, right? People who can protect your business, people who can give you money, loan you money. Obviously, the terms are not always great. But if you don't have access to the mainstream economic forces, you're going to find other ones. Same thing with sex work, right? If women were making a lot of money, they might not, right, engage in sex work in this time period, but they're not making money, or they're not even given jobs at all, right? And this is something that you can make money doing and make money for yourself, not be reliant on a man. Well, it's also a problem in cities, and it's targeted for reform by progressives. Workplace safety, Triangle Shirtwaist Fire is the big one here. It really, because it is women, right? It really is, it kind of shocks the public and gets the public attitude towards we need to do something about workplace safety, these conditions are not good, right? So that's the good stuff. The bad stuff, it does have, as I said, a kind of paternalist attitude towards immigrants and racial minorities. We, the progressives, are doing this for you. We, Jane Addams or Walter or Jacob Rees, Walter Rauschenbusch, we're the ones, right, who are helping you, right? So it's kind of like charity, right? Charities aren't started by poor people. Charities are started by rich people to help poor people, right? It's a kind of paternalist attitude of we can help you. We know best, and we know best. We know what you should be spending your money on. We know what religion is best for you. We know all of this stuff. So there's a paternalist attitude to the progressives, which is not great, right? They are for women's rights, but they're not always for women's suffrage. So it's like, whoa, whoa. No one said the right to vote. We just meant like not getting burned alive in a fire, right? No, we don't mean like the right. We're not going that far. So a lot of the Woodrow Wilson is someone who, like, on some things he's a very progressive, on others he's not so great. Racial issues, suffrage, etc. And sometimes this opposition to women's suffrage kind of marches along under the guise of states' rights, right? It shouldn't be a federal issue. It should be a state's issue. Who can vote and who can't, but it's still opposing. You're still opposing women's suffrage, even if you're doing it on some kind of federalist grounds. They do oppose, right, like labor-led. So they make some unions, right, which is the one that's in your book. I don't know to talk about. Well, the Women's Trade Union League, right? But in terms of labor unions that are led by labor, not right. Again, the paternalist attitude. You don't need that. No. You don't need to start your own. We got it. We got you. Like, just don't worry about it, right? Very paternalist. Part of the reason for this approach is the fear of radical politics, right? This is not a radical movement. The progressive movement's not radical. There's a radical movement to the left of them that the progressives are very interested on, like, keeping in, or I should guess pushing down, right? Keeping in check, because it's more radical, because it's led by labor, because their demands are broader and more expansive. And lastly, they're kind of anti-immigrant. It's like, yes, they're helping all of these immigrants, but like, we're good. We don't want any more of them. Like, we're good with what we got. Like, all of these other, like, new immigrants, we'll help them. We'll convert them to, like, evangelical Christianity and all that. But, like, no more. We're good. Let's turn off the stream of immigrants. So again, contradictions in this movement. On the one hand, very progressive on a lot of different issues. On the other hand, from our modern perspective, not so progressive on other issues. But again, this is from our modern perspective. The progressives in their time period were, well, progressive, right? They wanted change, they were fighting for change, and they were on a kind of like progressive margin of the American political spectrum. But they are also, right, products of their time period, and they have a lot of the faults of their time period. And it's not to say that all groups had this, right? There were plenty of groups that were advocating for labor-led labor unions or more immigrant rights, who were not afraid of radical politics, who were working together, different political orientations. But those were even more marginal than the progressive movement. That is all for now. That is all for chapter 18. And that is all for this particular approach to period 6. I have the feeling that chapter 19 is more of the same, except from a political perspective and not from a social and economic and cultural perspective. So chapter 18 looks to be social and cultural history, what people are doing, and then the next chapter 19 seems to be more of a standard political history of the same time period. So more of the same next time.